Okay. I'm very happy to welcome you this morning to the bucket class. Before we get started, please silence your cell phones and put them away. And if it applies to you, turn on your T-coil so that you can hear Karla really well. We're very happy to welcome again Karla Erickson from the college with her second session of Driverless Trucks, the case of truckers. We're kind of changing the name a little bit. Welcome to Karla.
Thanks, Joanne. Good morning, everyone. It's been kind of a treat. The last 2 weeks that we've gotten together, we've had late starts for school, so, you know, it's like the children are not getting together, but we all are, so it's kind of a treat for me when I get here and see all of you here. So thank you for coming out on a slick morning. So nice to see most of you back, and then to see a couple new faces from last week. So today we are going to do a deep dive into trucking, so let me just situate us in relationship to last week. So last week, you're such a wonderful audience, I didn't get through everything I wanted to get to, so I never introduced you to this computer that I want you to meet named Sophia, but we'll get to her next week. So what we're kind of doing is I laid out like the larger case on Monday, and today is going to be a deep dive into a particular case of truckers because it's a much closer at hand technology, right? Questions about artificial intelligence, whether we're talking 5 years or 50 or 200, are certainly further out, everyone would agree, than the question of driverless vehicles. So I'm going to start with that today. I also wanted to say many of you followed up with ideas and leads and connections, and I love that. I'm at the very beginning of this book, so I'm very easy to find. Basically, Karla and Grinnell will get you to me and get you to my email. So if you have thoughts about connections or other, you know, technological revolutions that seem connected to you. Some of you told me about literature I should be reading. I really welcome all of that. When I wrote my last book, How We Die Now, this group in particular really helped make that an interdisciplinary project, not just sociological. So I really want to invite that. And then before I start talking about truckers, which is not, I mean, I don't know that much about trucking except that I'm a labor sociologist, so I know a lot about work and its structure. But I don't know that much about truckers yet. I'm starting to get to know about the industry. How many of you have a trucking background, like personally, and have driven either delivery type trucks or over the road semi? Thanks, I had invited some truckers. And then, so some of you had had that as your job. And then going beyond that, how many of you in your immediate family or friend circle would claim a trucker as part of that? Okay, great. Thanks. So what you'll notice today when we do this deeper dive into one industry, my goal is to kind of think about these larger questions about machine-human relationships and use trucking as one way of thinking about that, right? And the reason that I'm really emphasizing trucking is today, well, sorry, one more thing to raise your hand. How many of you have been following discussions about driverlessness, about removing humans? I figured this, right? Like, I was pretty certain this group was following that. So I'm going to ask you to brainstorm at the top of the hour. But before we get into that, the reason I'm starting with trucks, and most of you, if you're following this, know this, is that when it comes to autonomous vehicles generally and getting humans off the road and having machines drive us around, trucking will go first. And that's very decided at this point. There's several reasons why trucking will go first. First of all, there's a little more over-the-road, straight arrow kind of driving, but also the financial incentives are profound, and the technology, including like platooning and other things that we're going to talk about for today, provide some opportunities that like driverless taxis don't. Clearly both things are going to happen, but I think experts agree right now that trucks are coming first. So that's why we're talking about trucks today. So I'm going to show you a couple of just short videos. The first one is 2014, the second one is 2017, just to think about what's happened inside the truck in the last 3 years, and then I'm going to have you do a little bit of brainstorming from your own knowledge and reading thus far.
People have been talking about the driverless car for a while now. Almost every week seems to herald some new record or test drive, always with the familiar caveat that such technology is still a ways off. But the first self-driving vehicles on the road may not be the ones taking them to work. that likely come from an industry where safety concerns and environmental issues demand a better solution than a human being constantly behind the wheel. The first self-driving car won't be a car at all. It'll be a truck. This is the Freightliner Inspiration, a prototype truck that is legally roaming the highways of Nevada.
Ready to go? As soon as Highway Pilot is available, we'll get an indication on the instrument cluster. So it's activated with the button press, and you'll notice
You're not doing anything at this point.
My feet are off the pedals. I look at you and still steer.
Right?
And so we're in autonomous mode.
The Inspiration uses a combination of GPS, radar, and video cameras to achieve what's called Level 3 autonomy. That means the truck can drive itself when the conditions are right, but a driver has to remain in the driver's seat and be ready to take over control in around 20 seconds if needed.
I'm being requested to take control of the system.
So if you don't,
As a result of not seeing driver interaction, it will slow itself down. It will apply the engine brakes, and then it needs to apply the vehicle brakes.
a Level 3 system like Freightliners makes a good degree of sense for a truck. Cruising along a monotonous stretch of freeway, let the computer take over. But once you pull into a city and have to negotiate that double-parked delivery truck and the traffic cop waving you through a red light, a human is better at the controls. In a given year, more than 3 million trucks carry 9.2 billion tons of cargo in the U.S. If computers, which never get drowsy or distracted, can shoulder some of that driving burden, human drivers will be more rested and alert when they do need to drive.
There's fuel efficiency impacts, safety, also maintenance. All of those things are benefits to moving freight across the country.
Freightliner's truck is a prototype, but the technology inside is actually pretty mature. What needs development aren't new sensors or microprocessors, but laws and regulations that will govern how these machines will exist in the world.
We want to have a conversation with the federal governments, with the state governments. That's what we really see as the next steps in order to bring autonomous driving to the road.
So I think I said when I first set out to work on this sabbatical project, I had planned to write the whole book on the case of truckers, right? Because I thought that driverlessness was so interesting and such an interesting juxtaposition between like what is our responsibility in the world, what should we rely on machines for, and what are the benefits and losses of both. So you'll see in that instance, again, that's a 2014 case that you hear about level 3. We'll talk about the levels in a minute. And you see, like, basically he's putting it on in the same way that you would put cruise control on, right? At the same moment that you would put cruise control on, except that it's not cruise control, obviously, it's the whole, it's the whole game, right? But in some ways there's a familiarity there, right, with that, because that's the moment when you start to hand over control to the machine. It's just a more robust control than we've been used to. You also then have that interface between human and machine where if the machine needs help, right, it's relying on the human. So that's level 3, and that's much more like at a collaborative level. So then this is 3 years later, 2017.
The better question was, how do we give customers that time?
EY helped us look at digital from every different angle. Digital, we're going to be able to make that experience even better than it is today.
So their expanse has So that short video, all I wanted you to see is just how physically different that is, right, in 3 years, where like the human is gone. The other thing that's interesting about Embark, and I think they're way above 50 now, a year after that, they're more at 100, but I looked it up and you can buy a kit for $30,000 to retrofit your Peterbilt truck. $30,000 is not a lot of money when it comes to trucks, right? So that's what they're doing, is they're packaging that, right? Because like when you look at, I mean, I think it's useful to look inside the truck. It looks just like a truck, right? Like there's just no human there. And as we've been talking about, you know, the whole structure of the truck is going to change over time. But right now we're using kind of this vacated cabin, right? Where even the steering wheel is there and it's turning. Now that's in part because, as I said, it's a little bit of a tugboat idea, right? Like it's a little bit like the truck does the open, you know, open water, open road. And then the human does the technically skilled stuff of getting them off the exit and then into the highway. But you can start, or into the town, or into the interaction, whatever that interaction the truck's going to have off of the highway. So just based on those two little videos, I was pretty sure that this crowd was well read about truckers, but in case you hadn't been, I wanted you to see those short truckers. So if you could just take a moment and write, if you're a writer, or think about what immediately pops to mind for you in terms of pros and cons. So what immediately pops to mind for you of like the replacement of humans by computers in over-the-road trucks. So just take a minute and think about maybe two of each, pros and cons, and then we'll talk. Okay, so let's start with what comes to mind in the room. Joanne, do you mind doing the microwave or microwave? Microphone. That was a weird word. Thank you so much. I'm gonna write down what we're hearing.
Well, you're the labor sociologist,
Yeah.
so the impact on, you know, the U.S. labor market.
Right. Okay, so what column is that in for you, George?
That's negative.
Okay, cons. Okay. Got it. Yeah.
Having some extended family that are truckers, and I see them, I know they're on the road all week. I see, well, one, they took the job for better income, but I see it plays havoc on family life. So a negative would be
Yeah. Yeah.
keeping them off the road for a whole week.
Absolutely, right? So, but that could be a positive, right? That's yeah, okay. So making trucking less taxing, right, on families,
Yeah.
on families and individuals, maybe, and the truckers themselves. Yeah, because clearly if like my job is to live near like my tugboat station, right, where I just kind of wait for stuff to come into Des Moines, you know, it's maybe 20 miles outside of Des Moines, and I just wait for the over-the-road truck to come in, and I hop in it, I'm gonna see my family a lot more, right, if that's fine. So definitely, what else comes to mind? Yes, Joanne, Chris.
I'm thinking about legal liability,
Yeah.
insurance, regulations, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, which column would you put that in?
Right in the middle right now.
Yeah, right, like question mark. That's what I would do too. Like, it doesn't have to be a problem, but since we don't have it figured out, right? It's a big one. Okay. Thank you, that's important.
I have to admit, I have a bias about being on the road with truckers. I find they're inconsistent, I find they're aggressive. I find that they really worry me about how much they've had because they have to get someplace, so they're taking substances.
Yeah.
So I think somehow, if this is improved, this would be a positive step. And again, I've read about they need to have drivers once they hit the city, so you're not going to have huge unemployment. I don't know when they'll ever solve that problem, not in my lifetime.
Yeah. So consistency, right? I mean, the consistency of the driver when it is replaced by a machine. Thank you.
any driver knows that you have blind spots. And when you're dealing with technology, you've got exactly the same problem. And so I worry about that, particularly when it comes to emergency situations. In the video, they talked about 20 seconds.
Yeah.
If you're doing 70 miles an hour down the highway, 20 seconds takes you a long way. What happens when some kid on a bicycle jumps out from a side road?
Right.
I don't see how technology is going to be able to respond to that quickly.
It's so true, right? So, I mean, humans have blind spots, but it's likely that the technologies that we use have blind spots, right? That we use for others to do.
Blind spot by doing this.
Right?
Fixed camera doesn't do that.
Exactly, absolutely. So different, like, maybe not the same blind spots, but blind spots. And then the emergency piece, I think is really interesting. I meant to do this before I came, but then I didn't. I don't remember how long my phone rings, but I think it rings for 30 seconds. Well, I miss it all the time. I don't know if you guys do. And so the idea of 20 seconds is just not very long, right? And then, the thing that programmers are really worried about is even if they run every, kind of programmable scenario with truckers, they worry about missing one. The one that comes up in the real world that you can't write into the program. Because if you talk to truckers who have lived their lives as truckers for 30 or 40 years, they have some pretty wild stories, right, about what can happen on the road. It seems impossible what happens on the road sometimes.
I always thought the truckers were just cowboys, and so what do we do with all that restless energy and people that you don't want that much at home?
Yeah. Nice. We don't want that much at home. But Dave, this is part of why I was so interested in truckers, because they're such a strong symbol of the United States and of the open road, and they have, there's kind of a strong symbolism around truckers. What I also found out from my research, and we'll get deeper into who truckers are, is they're often displaced workers. So they're often workers who have been displaced from previous changes in jobs. And so I do, like you said, exactly what you said, but I do wonder about what these workers will do, especially if their average age is 49. That's a hard time to make a career change.
A few years ago, the thought was to move all these trailers on the railroad.
Yes.
And take them to centering points to where the driver could pick it up within 50 miles of where they're going. And that would keep all those trucks off of the road.
Yes.
Whether they're with the driver or without a driver.
Yes.
I like that idea better.
Okay, so we have career change, which I did right now, I just talked back to Dave. And then we have railroad. So one of my concerns is exactly what you point out, that if we do this, we avoid, again, making use of rail, right? Right? It just kind of skips over that and keeps us in truck mode in terms of how we move the vast majority of our stuff. Plus, you like the idea better.
Well, it keeps the trucks off of the road.
Separate.
And plus, the driver has to take it to the job site within 50 miles. And that's just 50 miles out.
So it keeps people off the road. It keeps those two, forms of travel distinct, right? There's a lot to recommend it. Okay, so a con is that if we're investing in this technology, we may not be investing in new ways of using railroad to transport goods. How about two more, if you don't mind, Joanne? Okay, thank you.
Okay, mine is a little bit silly, but maybe not. It's the idea of being able to look at a vehicle and knowing there's someone in there. It's psychologically hard on the other drivers.
Thank you.
And also, I'd like to note that I once traveled cross-country with a 4-year-old who loved making the truck driver toot his horn. And that's something that will be missed in a strange little way.
I don't think it's silly at all. I think it's at the very heart of what I'm interested in, is questions of trust, connection, what are humans for? Is our goal actually to consume and transport as many things as possible? Non-human drivers will expand our capacity to acquire and transport goods. Who is going to buy the goods if there aren't any jobs? So that moment where you look in the cab and you don't see a face, there's a whole social world behind the fact that you don't see a face, right? In addition to your 4-year-old grandkid not being able to wave and honk. All the sense of freedom that's been associated with over-the-road travel. Yeah. So how about up here, Joanne, one more, and then we'll switch pace. Thank you for all the microphone.
concerned about weather changes.
Yes.
And I'm a bit concerned about weather changes with how many, and especially in snow like we experienced in Iowa this week, and sudden thunderstorms that are frequent in the south, and they're also frequent here. How does, because we already have the semis and the ditches with people in them, and I'm not sure we can program for the snow conditions.
So this is a moment that gets really interesting, right? Because, and thank you for bringing it up. So I'm really interested in how infrequently people talk about weather when they talk about what's the unresolved stuff. They do talk about like the emergency stuff, right? The stuff you can't plan for, and they're worried about that. But I'm surprised that they don't talk about weather, in part because our weather is getting less predictable. So this is like the intersection between global climate change and trucking, right? And so clearly, like, if you have a truck that's driving itself between Des Moines and Iowa City, for example, yeah, that makes sense until it does have an accident and flies off the road, right? Like a truck driver does a bunch of things in that moment, right? In those moments following the crash, right? Whether it's a minor crash, you know, you just have one wheel off and you can't get back on, or a major crash, right? So that humorlessness in that moment is a really interesting question to me, and I haven't seen a lot on that. I'm sure they're working on it in the labs, but it's not something that they're reporting out. And maybe that's because there's some unresolved matters there, you know? So, but it seems like even our weather historically, but our weather is, as you said, getting less predictable. Like it's not following historic paths, there's some pop-up storms, you know, all that kind of stuff in relationship to safety. Okay, thank you. So so we talked a little bit about that. And then the other piece I wanted us to think about, just take a moment and think in your own head, is to think about the jobs that you know are immediately fed by the fact that humans are in the driver's seat. Just take a minute and think about what comes to mind. So let's just hear 3 examples of what really, like, you're like, yes, this is an immediate consequence if we have a machine behind the wheel instead of a human. Yes.
Trucks don't eat. There's all those truck stops that, you know, would have a diminution. I think that's where they make a lot of money.
Absolutely, the eating, right? And then in the back, we got it, we got it.
Comment.
All right, how about up here? Sue? Yeah, sorry.
I'm just thinking of drivers who, so often accidents happen because they fall asleep.
Yes. Right?
Yes.
Yes.
So,
it's huge.
That's a biggie.
It's a big one. And so this is what's so interesting is the safety profile is a really good argument, right? Like both because truckers have at times felt pressed. You said you don't know what they're on, right? Like to at least drink Red Bull, but sometimes use uppers because what's expected of them is just ridiculous, right? In terms of the number of hours of being awake and alert. And we've all done this drive on these open highways. It's not very interesting, right? And so like they're just, you know, the mind struggles to kind of stay alert during that. And so that's a real issue. And so that's what's so interesting about the safety profile is like you can totally show that a machine is better most of the time at the Iowa City to Des Moines stretch, right? Like just is, but the issue is like there's this craft knowledge, right? There's this stuff around the edges that humans may have that trucks may be less able to acquire. And so thanks for that. So think about truck stops, obviously. So truck stops are a really good place to then think about the next level of that, and that is the way that the town, that the people who work at the truck stop rely on those workers, right? So if I-80, which is obviously, it's not just our example, but it's like the whole United States example. I don't know if you've noticed this, but every time somebody writes an article about driverlessness, they always send a journalist to I-80. Have you noticed that? To the I-80 truck stop. Because, you know, 5,000 people a day, right? It's been there since 1953. It's kind of a node of trucking, right? And so if you think about losing all that work, I mean, that's an incredible amount of work for all the surrounding towns. You can start to see a very quick kind of domino effect. So experts say that depending how you count it, we have 3.5, somewhere between 2 and 3.5 million truck drivers. 2 is the clearly over the road number, 2 million. Supporting staff, variations, you know, experts disagree about what the numbers are, but the number of jobs that primarily exist to support trucking are somewhere between 5 and 7 million. So what we didn't talk about is like all the people that arrange for the goods to get to the trucker, right? So all of those jobs, if that's no longer a human interaction, it's just an algorithmic interaction where like one computer tells another computer to go from X to Z, and you remove all those people who are like on phones and filing paperwork. If you remove all of those people, I think that's how you get to 9 million. But obviously that's a couple years out. But even if you just start to tick away at a percentage of truckers and a percentage of the people that support truckers and a percentage of the towns that rely on those people, it starts to happen pretty soon. So most experts liken it to when they move the main highway across the United States. And all the towns like Ladora and others that changed dramatically because of that relocation of the highway, except in this case, it wouldn't be relocating. Right? So that those industries that rely on people who pee and eat and shower and rest would go away, except that they wouldn't move. They would just kind of wrap up. So that's the job piece. Okay, so maybe you haven't had this experience, but I've had this experience of being like, in a very short order of time, this being something that's kind of in almost all science fiction, but didn't seem very close at hand. Seemed kind of par with flying cars, right? And then for me, all of a sudden, it's just really sped up, where it's like, yeah, so this is a truck driving across Nevada right now, right? Like, or this is a truck that drove across the United States. And so this was, I think, a nice summary from Wired in 2018, where they said, this has moved from maybe possible to definitely possible to inevitable, to how did anyone ever think this wasn't inevitable, to now commercially available. And part of what happened with that is the subject of my talk today, to help us think about how we got, kind of slowly and then very quickly to a point where this is coming soon to a highway near you. So here are some pros and cons, most of which we got to. I use access a lot, and what I mean by that is cars and trucks continue to be shaped for particular kinds of bodies with particular kinds of capacities. So one of the big gets of driverlessness is that you would not have to have a particular kind of use of your foot, right? You would not have to have a certain kind of vision. You would not, so around ability and disability, many more people can get transported, right? Because sitting in a vehicle is really different than operating a vehicle, right? Because now we can lay in vehicles if we needed to lay down. If you had incredible back pain that made it hard for you to ever sit, you could stand in a vehicle, right? Because you don't have to operate it anymore. So that's one of the real pros. And I would say of all the communities, I would say disability rights groups are very interested in driverlessness because it could really alter, improve quality of life. And you remember last week Gail talked about the Commodore 64 and that affecting, right? That like one of the big differences of technology is that it can at times level the playing field, other times it can deepen inequalities. Efficiency of use is not a big one like for us if we're sitting next to the truck, but for companies and corporations, this is huge, right? Now your trucks are being used all the time. You're going from 11 hours to 24 hours, boom, right? I'm still trying to chase down what all these reports mean when they say technology, environmental impact. I think primarily what they mean, again, is that consistency piece, that computers, when they drive, machines will drive them at a more steady rate, and they won't get drowsy, and they won't make random decisions, or they won't have gone to the bathroom and be like, I'm really tired, I'm gonna go to the bathroom again 90 minutes later, and as a result of that, fuel efficiencies are gonna be available. I also wonder when people talk about one of the pros of as being environmental, if they're also talking about the simultaneous move toward electric engines, right? And how much that could really be, you could just have vehicles moving constantly if they needed to stop for fuel less often and they also didn't have humans in them. So that could be part of what people are talking about when they talk about environmental advantages. I would go back to your comment, Jack, about that railroad is where we would get some real environmental advantages, right? Because you have trains going anyway. So if you could fill those up more, that's where you would get a lot of protection there.
They are doing some of that.
They are doing some of that, so. A big one that we didn't get up on the board, and so I should bring it up, is that, just like I talked about last week, where if an artificially intelligent being learns something, it can immediately teach every other being like it. That's similar with these trucks, and we know this, right? Like, how are we getting our GPS information, right? Have any of you ever used Waze, where it tells you how to get around like an accident or whatever? I mean, so that immediate access to just billions of data points is a real advantage to trucks, right? Because they can talk with each other better than a trucker can on a CB radio to kind of talk about what the road conditions are, and coordinate with each other. So people assume that if we moved entirely to computer-driven vehicles, there would be a lot better coordination than humans manage, a lot less honking. There'd be less honking and yelling. There would be less road rage. But that's, down the road. The big pro that we did talk about, but maybe it's in the background, is we wouldn't have to be operating the vehicle, right? So presumably we would have a lot more time to spend with each other and enjoy the journey. Alternately, we may have more time to spend with our phones, right? But either way, cons. Job loss is the big one. George brought that up. One that we did mention, but we should, can be hacked, right? So all the difficulties that we have around our technology when it's not working now begin to apply. Who was it that talked about when your tractor is offline, it just is out in the field? Thank you, I was thinking of you. Because it's kind of like that, right? Like you're talking about this is a very high-tech tractor, can sometimes get stuck all the way out there. So because this will rely on communicating with each other and some kind of online connection, you can think about the hackability of these machines. And then that gets pretty scary pretty fast, actually, doesn't it? To think about some kind of external unwanted control of an 80,000-pound vehicle. And then Chris brought it up, ethics of responsibility. So when I started doing this work, I didn't know how far along we were with the technology, and I'm going to show you some examples of how far we are. But it is the case that what is holding us up right now is this. I mean, I think the technology is available. It's not even that expensive. The cost savings is enormous. I'll show you those numbers. So it really is primarily federal law. And I'll show you the current state of play in terms of legislative preparedness. So here's those levels of autonomy. Oh shoot, this looks terrible, I'm sorry. Let's see if I can fix this. That looks awful. That helps a little. So, let's see if I can. So, did you see it? Levels of autonomy. There's lots of nice visualizations of this. So let's see if I can get one that's working. Okay, there's the one I picked out for us, but here's one. Okay, so level 0 is no automation of any driving functions. Level 1 is automation of driver assist functions, such as things that we all have in our cars: cruise control, automatic braking, those kinds of things, right? So we've gotten used to those already. Most of us are at level 1 if we have a newer car. Level 2, partial automation of central driving functions, including steering and acceleration, such as lane correction. How many of you have lane correction or like a cruise control that'll bring you back up to speed? Yeah, so you're kind of there. You're kind of at like 1.8.
It doesn't work if it rains.
No, are you saying? George just said it doesn't work if it rains. That's not good. That's not good. Okay. I mean, I have the kind of thing that warns you if things are around you, and it warns me about some really weird stuff, but that's a different kind of error. That's an error of excess than an error of omission if it doesn't work when it's raining, right? Yes, I'm going to come over with my microphone so I can hear you. I'm going to lean in by you, hopefully it's not creepy. Okay.
This may be kind of a silly question, but it's popped into my mind. And I don't know anything about flying airplanes, but for years I have heard, well, they put it on automatic pilot control. So I'm wondering if we have any airline pilots in here that can speak to the automation of
Thank you.
and problems and
absolutely.
dangers that go with
problems and dangers that go with flying. So
with the automatic.
I think it's like my own stuff that I haven't been looking at the pilot issue, but this is part of what got me to this project. I don't know if this helps, is that my friends who work in the industry say that planes will come first, and planes could be just doing it right now. It's merely the psychological issue that you won't be able to get passengers on planes without a pilot in the seat. And I mean, the best example of this is really Sully. Remember when he landed the plane in the river? Even at that particular, so Sully was the one that landed a plane in the river against the computer's advice, remember? Right. And then they tried to punish him, and the court proceedings turned out that he was right, but it was within like tenths of a second. And it was the case that all the other pilots in that plane and any other plane at that moment up in the sky, Sully was probably the only guy that had that craft knowledge, right? Because the rest of the pilots who were just a couple years younger, hadn't flown it as much. I think Sully was in the military, right? Like even they already didn't have that craft knowledge. And so when I say craft knowledge, I just mean the enduring, the deeply known, tacit competencies that come out of doing work over and over and over again. He had it so deeply, he ignored the computer, and he risked a bunch of people's lives on his certainty, and he was right, and he saved them, right? Because the subsequent simulation showed that all those people would have died if he wasn't as sure, well maybe not died, but the whole thing would have crashed, and most of them would have died if he wasn't so certain about his tacit knowledge. So going back to your question about right now, in any, just kind of commercial airline, the pilots are doing very little flying. They're there mainly for our psychological benefit. And also they don't have the kind of craft, skilled knowledge that Sully has in their training, right? And so if there is an emergency, already they will step in with a more limited, set of knowledge than previous pilots have had. So that's what I hear from pilots. Even airline attendants are really, like if I talk to people about what I'm working on, they're like, oh, well, I mean, we're surprised that we're not going first, because they're really aware of like how little the pilot does. I don't want to insult pilots, but just like that work has already been de-skilled, right, in a lot of ways. So, so thank you for bringing it up. I don't think it's weird at all. I think our minds should go there. One of the reasons I'm focusing on vehicles on the ground is, again, just for my own comfort level, but also because it remains the case that not everyone flies. So I think it's important to pick a technology that we all interact with, regardless of how wealthy we are, right? So that's the only reason that I'm focusing on these particular kinds of machines, but a lot of the same questions in here. So level 3, we're talking about conditional automation of driving a human is required to take over as needed. And so the reason I wanted to emphasize this is, remember the very first video that we saw from 2014? That's the level he was operating at. He referred to level 3, and you could see it, right? Like you could see level 3 operating. So we basically aren't at level 3 anymore, right? Like that's why I showed you a 2014 one, because we kind of jumped over that now. So now we're at level 4. Driving functions mostly automated. A human may need to take over, etc. in bad weather. So now we're at level 4 in the sense that maybe a human driver is going to be needed to navigate the complications of a city, and maybe they're going to need it in kind of extraordinary circumstances, but they're no longer needed to just get off the exit. So like in the 2014 video, it was getting off the exit. That's kind of over, that's been resolved. So level 5 is full automation, in which you don't have any humans in the vehicle. You're still going to have humans that are remotely connected to the vehicle, in the sense of air traffic controllers, right? So you're still going to have somebody who can kind of drop down into the machine when needed, but they're not going to be solely assigned to that machine. Okay, I was interested in how it's going to look. This is how driverlessness is often depicted, that we'll replace ourselves with like, an automaton looking or an android looking driver. And you can tell already that's changing, right? Like the cockpit's going to change. You're not going to put some human because we're not great at driving, right? Like our bodies aren't made to drive. And so, the cockpit is going to change over time. It's not going to look like this. More likely, this is a picture that we saw on the very first day, just to get that sense of, and to get you used to that feeling of, what it feels like if you even see someone looking down at their phone. I've seen people putting on mascara, reading newspapers, but here he's like allowed to do this, right? I don't know how he does that physically. For me, that would be really hard to like be in the car but not be driving the car, but that's what he's doing. And as we've said, we all get used to it in bits and pieces. We're used to cruise control, most of us, right? So you have probably seen these vehicles, so I wanted to bring that up. Those are the ones that are either driverless, or they're usually just collecting data for GPS and other systems. So they're data collecting vehicles, but they're preparing the ground that we're talking about. That's why they're out there. You'll see more and more of them. And then here's one visualization, not a visualization, but like an existing vehicle. Nobody owns it yet, but of what it might look like when we get rid of ourselves as drivers. I like this one because I don't know if you can tell, but it has pictures that children have drawn around the edges. So anyways, I liked that little detail. You'll notice even on this one that there's a little bit of a cockpit up on the, I think that's just for psychological reasons, right? Like, because obviously you can't whip that seat around and take control of that vehicle. So, this one's nice because they're actually sitting looking at each other. I've seen other ones where it's just like, you know the fancy movie theaters where you lean back in the leather chair? I've seen a lot of the car visualizations that are like that, where it's like just two seats and now you have a screen right in front of you, and it's like, okay, so we're just like freeing ourselves up for more screen time, right? So this one was a little bit more social, or you could imagine having a business meeting, right? So you're on the way somewhere, you're gonna have a business meeting on the way. So I think I'm gonna end it there and start with possible approaches. Are we at 5 or how many do we have left? Is that good? Okay, thanks, Joanne. Okay, so we'll take a 10-minute break, right? And we'll get back at 10:02. Okay, thanks, everyone. 80, and that's probably where it'll happen, and we look over and there's nobody in the seat. And I think that will happen in most of our lifetimes in the room. So one of the things that has been a focus in Europe in particular, and Canada, I think, is the notion of a convoy. So that's on the right. A convoy has driven across Europe many times successfully. A convoy is in a situation in which you're getting a lot of, you can see that, right? You're getting a lot of drafting efficiency from having those 3 trucks. So you've got fuel economy gains there. You probably have 1 driver in total in the 3 vehicles. I'm not loving that because it's 240,000 pounds instead of 8, but anyway. But you can see why there's a lot of economies of scale there. As a driver, this is a little intimidating to be next to, right, the convoy. So there's that, but like from the perspective of like maximizing the effect of 1 human, that's something that's being thought about. So that's the convoy approach. Collaboration is more what we saw in the second video, right? Like that's where there's like a driver in the truck somewhere, and they can step in if they need to. Again, we have that kind of issue about like timing, like how much time do you have to go from like relaxing to driving. I mentioned the tugboat approach. I think that, to me, like as a metaphor, makes the most sense, right? That you have this vehicle that's navigating the simpler part of its job without a human, and then a human joins it for the more difficult part. So that's why I'm calling it a tugboat approach, because I think that makes some sense. Further down the road, you probably have remote driving, where you basically have vehicles all around the country that are driving, and if they need a driver, they get one. But that driver is like in some cheap labor environment, so they're in like some, you know, out of the way town in Texas, right? And that's where they live and work. And so they're not very expensive to pay because of where they're located, and then they can drop into a truck if it needs a driver. Not drop in, but you know what I mean, like remotely drop in and help that truck. That's what I was likening to air traffic controllers, but as you pointed out, Greg, the air traffic controllers can't currently drop into a plane, but I suspect that we might be moving towards that with pilots too, that there will be some remote access to planes rather than having a lot of human labor inside the cockpit. So that's the remote driving. That's a little further off, so I don't want to haunt your dreams with that prospect. So yeah, and then air traffic controllers are another good example of something that eventually will be pretty automatable, because machines can take in so much information so much faster, right, than can a human mind. And so even though I'm using that metaphor, some of those jobs are also considered automatable in the short term. So I brought up one of these the other time. Birra by Volvo is something you'll see a lot. She exists. The thing that's cool about Birra is, like, so this vehicle underneath is a little bit more like train cars. We're having kind of a train theme today. That vehicle can just detach itself and go pick up another one, just like a semi-truck would, but, you know, just is this very tiny little machine that can move, you know, things of all different sizes, right? And so that already exists, as does this. This is being used very actively right now in logging environments, with no space even for a human, as you can see. Obviously, in logging environments, you can have horrible accidents, but you don't have the same ratio of like humans and vehicles with humans in them. Okay, so that leads me to my big question. When I got kind of this far down the rabbit hole, which I suspect some of you are exactly this far down the rabbit hole, I thought, how did this happen so like slow and then fast? And I think that the answer to that is really the 2004 Grand Challenge. So I'm going to show you part of a longer video, and it's really easy to find. I, again, on the 4th day, will like get my act together and give you all a recommended watching and reading list, and this will be on that. So this is where we are in real time. In 2016, the semi-automated platoon crossed Europe. In 2016, there was do you remember this? There was this big media event of Budweiser being delivered 130 miles. Elon Musk, not Elon Musk. The Tesla, it's fully electric semi-truck was released. These things are not talked about together all the time, but I think maybe they should be, because that battery technology that Musk is like really focused on will also have huge implications, because again, a lot of the jobs that circulate around vehicles circulate because we pee, because we eat, and because we need fuel, right? And so if any of those things stop being true, that has a pretty profound job impact. So you know the thing on the right is a Waymo. We'll end with Waymos, but just for now, I'm going to show you the beginning of this this video about the Grand Challenge. Because I think it's how we got here.
Revlon introduces new Ultra HD matte rooms. Hydro Matte so creamy, so comfortable. Why compromise when you can have it all?
Self-driving cars aren't just here, they're everywhere. They're still in testing, sure, but this technology is on its way. It's just a matter of when and where it'll land first. And when that happens, robot cars will likely change society as we know it, just as the personal automobile did a century ago. People have dreamed of owning a self-driving car for generations. Until recently, it seemed impossible.
So I always thought autonomous vehicles would happen. To be honest, I didn't think I'd see it in my lifetime.
The idea of a driverless car became a lot more real about a decade ago. That's when a group of engineers and roboticists gathered for an unprecedented competition called the DARPA Urban Challenge.
This is absolutely astounding.
Each team brought something unique to the table, from breakthroughs in artificial intelligence to advanced laser sensors to, well, let's just call it public relations. It was the moonshot of the robotics world.
Without the challenge idea, there would just not be a self-driving car today. The task looked incredibly hard. The car would drive itself without a person inside.
I think the Grand Challenge proved to the world that it was possible.
When we think of autonomous cars today, it's Tesla, Google, and Uber that come to mind. But the industry wasn't born in Silicon Valley or even Detroit. It came from here, of all places. In the early 2000s, Congress decided to invest in driverless vehicles, not so that we could commute to work while checking Facebook, but to keep soldiers safer on the battlefield. And they tapped the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, aka DARPA, to make it happen. That's the same agency that helped create the Predator drone and Agent Orange, along with GPS and the internet. So in 2004, the US government held a new kind of competition to jumpstart the industry, the DARPA Grand Challenge. It was the first of 3 races that would help make self-driving cars a reality.
Before the DARPA Grand Challenge, the US government had spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to build self-driving cars. And lo and behold, most of this money didn't yield the expected results.
Instead of funding its usual stable of defense contractors, DARPA decided to open the problem up to anyone interested in cracking it. It would hold a race across the Mojave Desert for 100% driverless cars, with $1 million prize for whoever finished fastest. The response was enormous. Teams applied from all over the country, representing universities, high schools, and groups of friends with a taste for engineering.
DARPA didn't have any preconditions for participation, right? Like anybody could show up, and you saw everybody show up. It felt like it was anybody's game.
But from the beginning, the Grand Challenge had a front runner. Carnegie Mellon University, home to the nation's oldest and most prestigious robotics institute, and also to William "Red" Whitaker, a former Marine who'd sent robots into hazardous environments like nuclear reactors and volcanoes.
It isn't enough just to do the technology and hide it in a laboratory. It really matters to take it to the world.
On the day of the challenge, in March 2004, the 15 finalist teams gathered in the desert northeast of Los Angeles. They would start 5 minutes apart, each following a GPS route that would take them 142 miles from Barstow, California to Primm, Nevada.
Ladies and gentlemen,
First out of the gate was Carnegie Mellon's Sandstorm, a 1986 Humvee with the roof chopped off and the seats ripped out. In their place was a half-ton box stuffed with computers. To give Sandstorm an edge, the team collected satellite imagery to figure out the fastest, safest route across the desert.
Sandstorm put the hammer down, and you could really see the punch at that point. The dust was flying, and it was heading to the finish line.
But most teams struggled just to get out of the starting area.
Lake Village in San Diego, ladies and gentlemen, the Spirit of Causeway.
Out of the gate, Spirit came out, took a left, was looking at the gate ahead to the right, and decided that it was too narrow or there was something going on, and so it took a U-turn, and we didn't make it very far, and we had to turn off at about 20 or 30 feet.
Meanwhile, Carnegie Mellon's Sandstorm was racing ahead until it hit a series of hairpin turns known as Daggett Rich. And that's where damage from a crash during testing a few weeks earlier came back to haunt them. The sensors misread the road, and the Humvee got stuck.
So it's on the smoke that did that until the race officials did it.
At the end of the first challenge, the dream of self-driving cars still seemed out of reach.
When we didn't have a finisher, that was a hard time. The way people look at challenges is if someone finishes, that was a success, and if they don't, it was a failure. I mean, for the scientists among us, that's just another data point, but people want to see somebody get through to the end.
For better or worse, everybody struggled that first grand challenge. CMU got the furthest. They went, almost 8 miles, and the rest of the teams did pretty poorly, so we were in good company.
What DARPA had done was create a community of people eager to crack the self-driving car problem. So the agency announced it would give them another shot at the 2005 group.
So what happens that I think is so important, I think this probably happens on a level that we wouldn't all see unless we follow these kinds of things, is that it really, like she said, really opens up the possibility that this is doable, right? Like, because even though they're fails of like minor level, small magnitude fails. And so they continue to reissue it until somebody wins. But also what happens in that moment is even with this first grand challenge, but subsequent grand challenges where the vehicles can do it autonomously, you see a real shift in investment. Right? So like all the investment projections for driverlessness prior to the DARPA challenge are stay away from it, it's the Jetsons, it's never going to happen, right? But then the investment profile changes dramatically, and so you see all these big companies getting into the game because it starts to suddenly seem really viable. So for those of us who may not be working in the industry, this seems very sudden, and there's this is one of the real key kind of cultural nodes. You create all these workers, right, who have been who are passionate about this, who are just about there, right? It's within reach for them. You hire them. So all the stuff that we're seeing now with like Waymo and the trucks that I've been showing you are many of those labs and those businesses are staffed by people who were part of the DARPA challenge initially, right? Because it became like the labor force of a new industry. And so now you have these kinds of players, right? You have Volvo and Mercedes and Nissan. You don't just have Tesla and Google. You probably see more about Tesla and Google, but all of the major players are in. And the money that is flowing towards the goal is profound, and we'll get to that in a minute. That vehicle is a vehicle where, I want to show you that. Oops. Never mind, it's freaking out. Okay. Speaking of technology. Okay, this one I think is kind of interesting. See how you can stand in that, so you would just kind of pop in and it would carry you a short distance. Okay, so trucking today. So trucks carry 70% of all goods in the US. This is increasing. Why is it increasing? One word answer. Amazon. Trucking is the largest job in 29 states, including Iowa. So the flip side of Amazon, by the way, is most of you know about the Mall of America and how massive that place is in Minneapolis or St. Paul. That much mall space, so something equivalent to the Mall of America, it closes every week in the United States right now. So when, like about 10, 15 years ago, we were worried about the brownstones. The brownstones are like, obviously Main Street's been in trouble for a while, but those mall spaces are just collapsing. And so if all of that commerce, even what remains of the mall commerce, is going to trucks, we're obviously going to need a lot more trucks. So even if like Amazon's not your jam and you aren't attracted to Amazon and you try to buy in person, it's going to get harder and harder, I would say, to buy in person. Trucking is the largest job in 29 states, including Iowa. We are one of those states. 5,000 people, we already talked about that. We talked about the median age. This is really important. So even though the trucking industry is still predominantly white, it is disproportionately Black and Latinx as compared to other industries. And it also does, even though it doesn't pay anywhere nearly as well as it once did, it does pay better than similar jobs, and it pays even better for Black drivers and Latinx drivers than it does for white drivers, right? So it's like a pretty good price point if you're looking for like a lower middle class livelihood, and certainly better than a lot of blue collar work. Another data point that I think is really interesting is just of all African Americans, 4% of African Americans drive for a living. So one of the really weird things, one of the really weird optics that is going on is if you're reading about technology, you're probably hearing two things. One, we're close to driverlessness. Two, there's an incredible shortage of drivers. Incredible shortage of drivers, right? Like estimates vary, but we're short 50 to 100,000 drivers right now, and those numbers are only going to go up, and trucking companies are having a lot of trouble getting people to commit to the job. The turnover is extreme. So here's just a couple ways of thinking about that. So as of 2017, because that's backward looking, we can definitely agree that there were 50,000 short then, but we're looking more at 200,000 drivers short right now in terms of what we would need to meet capacity. You hear this if you know anybody who drives for UPS or over-the-road truckers, they're just pressed, right? They're just pressed because the workers that we do have worse jobs because we don't have enough of them, right? So even if this is wrongly estimated, that pressure, right, is probably going to speed up the automation process. Wages in 2015 of a typical production worker in the US earn 9% less than a comparable worker in 73. So this is part of the context for me of being a labor ethnographer. I was born in 1973. Real wages have been dropping from the moment I was born, and yet we have a real story of employment going down and up and all those kinds of things. But the fact of the matter is real wages have been dropping pretty steadily since 1973. At the same time, over those same now 46 years, the American economy has grown by more than 200%. So I'm going to show you that in a minute, but the point is that as all of our increases in capacity and output have grown, workers have not put that money in their pockets, right? Corporations have. And we know this because we know that this is what has led to the concentration of wealth, right? 1980 average salary was $38,000. This is for truckers. Today, if you kept it at that $38,000 level, a trucker should make $114 grand. Well, I think if truckers were making $114 grand, we would not have a shortage, right? But instead, they're making $41,300, which is like barely an improvement, right, over a 1980 salary. And so this helps to explain the turnover. The turnover is 90%.
Oh, wow.
And that's incredible because if you think about the training that goes into being a driver, that's huge. So the investment for the company is real, right? Like if you are training and training and training and you're losing all, nearly 100% of your workers in a given year, that's incredible, So many truckers are displaced from other industries. We talked about that already. And this was the way that Wired said it. And I think it's important. Primarily right now, the trucking industry is working hard to diversify, but primarily right now, trucking is made up of men who might otherwise have done the kind of factory work that's left the country over the last 3 decades or so. And this goes back to something that Dave said in the back about, we tend to think of truckers as like cowboys of the road and people with restless energy or whatever. But they're people who have already been hurt by the economy previously. And that may condition their reaction if they get shut out of this industry as well. Okay, so the case for removing human drivers, we talked about most of this stuff already, but the thing that I want to highlight is the safety piece. We have become inured to 3,500 deaths due to trucking accidents in the United States. We're just used to that, right? So that is something that when we talk about safety, those are real lives, right? And so that's a pretty good selling point. There are these other things we're worried about with these truckers, but right now, even the trucks that have just been driving continuously, because we have driverless trucks that have millions of miles on them already in the United States, they are safer than we are. They just are, right? And so that's not small. I mean, you could balance a lot of downsides up against those lives, right? So that is really important and probably the most important thing. So there are 350,000 fatal traffic events in the United States, but there are you know, between 3,000 and 4,000 every year deaths due to an accident with a semi. So some of the other things we talked about, the big one that I wanted to just highlight for you is just what kind of money we're talking about. The pot of money is profound. One of the guys I'm going to tell you about is Andrew Yang, who's running for president. He talks about these two pots of gold, like the driverless pot of gold and the artificial intelligence pot of gold, and he likens it to like the new oil. You know, in the sense that like the rush for this is like a gold rush, right? So people have been using Moonshot to talk about, you know, the power of this, the interest of this for scientists and researchers. But in terms of money, whew, you know, there's not much that compares to it. So here's some money stuff. $168 billion a year is the anticipated gain from getting rid of human drivers. $70 billion is due to labor, but you also have fuel efficiency gains, your productivity gains, and then you have all the costs associated with accidents. You know, most of these gains come as a result of the 11 hours to 24 hours, but they also come as a result that, like, computers don't get divorced or get the flu or help each other grieve, and all of those things take time. They don't get shoulder injuries, they don't. So you can just see the incentive there, and I think that that's important if we're talking about a sociology of machine-human relations, because that just is an incredible amount of compulsion, right, to get drivers, human drivers, out of the vehicle, if that's the kind of money you're talking about. And if you combine that with the fact that you currently have a shortage that we're having trouble addressing, that's a lot of incentive for corporations. The other thing that's happening that we'll get to more in weeks 3 and 4 is that Lyft drivers and Uber drivers are very specifically and very directly being used to collect the data to replace themselves. And that is the most diverse workforce. That's one of the most diverse workforces in the country, actually, is Uber and Lyft drivers in terms of gender and race and class. And Lyft and Uber drivers do tend to support creative jobs. A lot of people who are those kinds of drivers also work in theater or do something like that. And their jobs, it's very explicit. Like, these two companies are not at all, they don't cover up the fact that, like, we're eager to get the drivers out of the seats, but they're collecting all the data of, like, what we need and when do we back in a vehicle and all that stuff. They're building those data points into their future projects. So we're going to skip over this video and go to truckers responding. So if we have more time, I was going to ask you what you think truckers' responses are, but I have to say that, like, at this point in my research, I can't really figure out what truckers' responses are. Individual truckers that I speak to are very aware of the nearness at hand of this, and they're nervous about it. And it's often the case, and we know this psychologically and sociologically, a driver who is currently driving and who knows that driverlessness is on the horizon, and you can relate to this, is they usually have their own plan. Where they say, well, I think this is going to be about 2025, so I'm going to be okay. Right? So they all have like that plan. Now, if there's truckers that are involved in unions, and you ask them, then they tend to refer to their union's position on this. Union positions are opposed to this, right? Because it's the end of an industry. So that's pretty straightforward. But unions aren't coming out and just saying that. They're emphasizing safety. They're emphasizing, you know, craft knowledge, the emergency situation, you know, all the things that drivers know. They're saying, like, we're not replaceable. These are all the ways that we're better than machines. One of the ways that truck unions have been successful thus far is in slowing the federal legislation. So that has been one of their tactics, right, to use their collective power to do that. I think, this is my official position, we are very distracted by debating when it is very clear that it is going to happen. And so I think we should be talking more about how. Because I think that, you know, sitting around debating whether it's 2025 or 2050 when there are no humans driving vehicles, I don't, you know, that doesn't get us very far if we don't have a plan. So I think we distract ourselves by debating how close we are. One of the examples that I'll give of that is that people in the field who are developing the driverless technology vary a lot in their opinion about how close we are. Similarly, the Wright brothers felt that they were about 50 years away from human flight 2 years before they flew. So even the people who are closest to a question, prognostication is not reliable, but what we know is that it is going to happen, right? And so the idea of like making plans for when it happens seems to be the most proactive strategy in my mind. Here's an example of a trucker who's been very active. This is Finn Murphy. He wrote a book about over-the-road trucking. It's a great book. The other book I would recommend, and I'll put it on my list too, is this book called Driverless, Intelligent Cars and the Road Ahead. And so if you're kind of into these things, this really talks about the technology and how we've gotten here, some of the ethical questions that arise and all that. So both of those books are really nice, and I'll put those on my recommendation. But here's Finn writing in the Guardian. I think this is a beautiful piece. He ends the piece by saying, the only humans left in a modern supply chain are truck drivers. And if you think really hard about an Amazon transaction, he's got a point, right? So in a way, they're kind of dinosaurs, if you think about that kind of interaction. For drivers like me, driverless trucks are the power loom and the sheepskin. I didn't know the sheepskin reference. Apparently he's referring to, when people had been drawing in caves and they kind of emerged from the caves and found out that other groups of people were using sheepskin to record imagery, so that's what he means by sheepskin. There are about 3 million of us in the US alone, and we will soon be extraneous, roadkill, so to speak, except we won't be dead. That makes us, as one driver said, disposable people. Too bad for us, you might think. We're on the wrong side of history. Maybe so, but guess what? You're next. When automation starts displacing lawyers, accountants, and bankers, then we might see some pushback about the social costs of technology. So as long as it's only truckers and factory workers getting sacked, well, there's always Walmart, McDonald's, or food stamps. What we want is to work and support our families. We're citizens. We coach soccer and go to parents' night at school and pay our taxes. Who is taking responsibility for the human costs runaway technology is causing? Not the companies reaping enormous benefits, not the fleet owners, not the software engineers, not governments. So what I like about this piece is he's so informed and he's so engaged in these debates, but when he asks that question about who is taking responsibility for the human cost that runaway technology is causing, I think that that's something that I as a sociologist and we as concerned citizens can play a role in having some traction around that question. And not just technology, but thinking about social questions, right? Like thinking about the social, psychological, spiritual, economic consequences of this technology. The technology has its own logic. And when you tie it to the capitalist impulse to access $162 billion, that's a pretty strong motivation. But we can make choices along the way, right, about how we're going to respond to this. I also think it's interesting because he ends with not governments, which tends to be true. The Canadian and Japanese governments have been very active and very vocal about having plans for responsible artificial intelligence and things like that. The US has not, but interestingly, if you just rewind a couple minutes back, we were watching a video that was inspired by the government, right? Like the government hosted the DARPA challenge, which in many ways began this whole movement. This is a moment that I really like because it captures some of the things that machines may not be able to do as well as us. The drivers are getting in and out of the truck, they're moving axles, they're checking brakes, checking air hoses, they're talking to people. Building a self-driving truck is not just about finding a way to have the truck drive in a straight line on a highway. There's so much to be done there before you get anywhere near being able to do the things that truck drivers are doing in an industrial facility or even on surface streets. So that was in the Atlantic last year, truck driver. This was the last piece that I'll end here. Here's my concern. We can value craft knowledge, but with the momentum of that big bucket of money and the technology being nearly there, we're likely to see a drop more like this, and then also this. So this to me is the kind of responsibility piece. This is the divergence of manufacturing employment, which is the blue line, versus manufacturing output, which is the red line. And all the things that we're going to be talking about in these 4 weeks, whether it's driverless trucks or artificial intelligence, threaten to actually swing that red line even higher, like output buildup, like you can't imagine. But this nosedive of what we get paid to do worries me on obviously a social level, and also I'm not really sure who's going to have the money to buy the stuff. So in both ends of that. So that really is, as a labor sociologist, this is what I worry about, is the kind of acceleration of a pattern that we're already witnessing. Here are some unrecoverable work, travel agents, phone operators. Somebody had, I think it was Joan, talked about phone operators. So what stops the inevitable? Legislation is one. So these are the states that have had some laws passed. There's only a few states, as you can see, that none are considered. The federal legislation was very in play last year, but it didn't get finished. I just wanted to show you the names of these because they're pretty funny. I won't harp on this, but the American Vision for Safer Transportation Through Advancement of Revolutionary Technologies. And actually, this one prevents humans from suing the company that made the car that hurt them. So its name is kind of counterposed. And then the Safely Ensuring Lives Future Development or Deployment and Research in Vehicle Evolution Act, the Self-Drive Act. We'll skip over that. The last thing I want to show you is this one piece, and we'll end here. When I think about responses to all of this, to this momentum, one of the things that's been really fascinating is that there's a Waymo service to get to work. Waymo are those cute little white cars that we saw. And some humans have been reacting really strongly to these Waymo vans that are taking people. So I had another video that I'll show at another time where the Waymo, they're called first riders. These are the first people that ride to work in the Waymo, and they've been doing it for a couple of years now. They're really proud of their role in like helping this technology learn and all that. But you also have a lot of resentment in the surrounding region that you may have seen, but I wanted you to see.
Rich see the world of possibilities. Some think cooking is old-fashioned, but in this day,
sorry about that.
ways to get
Oh, there we
people
go.
together, getting them to stop.
Okay. So just watch the slow-mo here.
Yeah. This is a rough one, Will.
Yeah, there's problems in Arizona.
Man, wielding rocks and knives, Arizonans attack self-driving cars. Did you know that self-driving cars were under attack?
No.
Neither did I.
But I feel like I'm going to.
What appears to be happening, there is a resistance to the self-driving experiments going on specifically in Arizona. There's like 20 plus incidents of people attacking self-driving Waymo vehicles that are trying to figure out how to get better.
So it's fascinating sociologically. There's been between 26 and 35 incidences a year of physical violence against a car, which is so interesting because we don't otherwise attack cars, right? Like, so it's like a new form of violence. But it shows like the sense of like angst and just powerlessness, right, that people are feeling in response to these vehicles that are very quietly popping up, right? Like the fact that some people for a couple of years now have been getting driven in an empty, you know, like a humanless vehicle is pretty fascinating, right? And so what are they doing? They're standing along the streets, they're sneaking up on vehicles, and they're attacking them with like really old rudimentary weapons, right? Like a knife. Right? And so it just bespeaks of the challenges of like what resistance could even look like, right, to this new era that we're in and the results of these moonshots. So I'll leave things there, and thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any comments or questions, we have a few minutes to work on those.
I have well, I guess it's two questions. One is there any discussion about taxing robots?
Thank you. Yeah, this is huge. So this is where I'm gonna, sorry, there were boys doing yoga. Yeah, so I'm very interested in that because that's how you get at that pot of gold, right? Because it's a little less scary to pursue those huge pots of money if you think of those as somehow going to all of us rather than them going to like literally 5 men who we could all name in this room, right? Like in terms of who, you know, like it's unclear which of those companies is going to get to like the moonshot landing, right? The moment where you get to driverless trucks, the moment that you get to artificial intelligence, but we know who the players are, right? And those people are already like just, you know, wealthy beyond, you know, imagination. And so if there's some way that we could access that so that it was spread around, there would be other threats that we've talked about, right? About kind of human culture and joblessness and stuff like that, but it wouldn't be of the same magnitude. And so yes, definitely people are talking about taxing robots and taxing these technologies. Because in the past we have missed that, right? We haven't used that, at least here, as a way of spreading the wealth of, you know, our fabulous minds and what we come up with, right? So yeah, I am going to end on that like in weeks 3 and 4. So certainly many people in my position who have been thinking about the end of work for a long time are certainly in support of a universal basic minimum income because we have no idea what we're going to get paid to do in the future, but that is different than taxing the technologies. I would be an advocate for both, personally, but yeah, that's definitely where we need to be thinking because we have historically thought, well, you get a job to make a living to buy these things, and that whole logic is being unraveled.
Gene Bubbles. My naive hunch is that the transition from level 4 to 5 is going to be the one that will take all the time. And at level 4, that's the one that had the trucker monitor inside. Does this trucker monitor at level 4 have to be conscious?
Okay, so I don't have good answers, but this is pretty much where I'm at in terms of thinking about, I think that something in the middle is true, right, about the kind of shortage problem with truck drivers. So it appears to be the case that when we get to level 4, where we're going to have humans in the trucks, but they're not going to be doing all the driving, it may sweeten the job, so it may improve the job may be less taxing. If you have fewer drivers, it may lower wages, right? So it may have it, right now it's ironic because we're at a shortage, but we may quickly go to a glut, and then if we do that, that may lower the wages. But it may sweeten what the job looks like. Technically speaking, I just can't find any kind of writing out of the world, I'm sure they're considering it in these driverless labs, that explains how I go from relaxing and watching Netflix to driving. Like, because clearly I do if I know that I'm approaching Des Moines, right? Like there would be a notification, I would have a couple minutes to get up and get organized and enter Des Moines, but I can't figure out that next level, right, where I'm like just occasionally interacting with the truck. That part I haven't been able to find much on, so I'm still working on it, to be honest, And it's a little bit like, I don't know who to ask, right, and who to go about what that looks like. But there's definitely this very in-between mixed moment where all the levels that we talked about are going to coexist for a while, right? And I don't know exactly what the labor consequences of that is going to be. And it's an industry that could be less hard on its workers, right? Their bodies are very negatively impacted by driving and stuff like that. And then it's also an industry that, at least recently, has been struggling. So, some people say there will be fewer drivers, they'll be better paid. Other people say even in the intermediate stage, it'll kind of bottom out the already lowering wages. So there's a lot of unknowns.
I think Nancy.
Yeah, Nancy.
I'm not sure how pertinent this is, but is the oil and gas industry actively working against this, or are they trying to become a part of the solution?
Well, they are focused on the batteries, right? Like they're very focused on the batteries. I mean, there's definitely a battle there. Yeah, the consequences for fuel, it's pretty clear that machines use less fuel. So there's a little bit of an improvement, but I think when you have Musk going so hard after the battery market, that's actually where probably those lobbies are focused, right? Like making it harder for batteries to enter the market. Because that's going to be a tipping point when, obviously we have some batteries, right? Some of you may be using them in your vehicles, but when you get to that tipping point where fuel is no longer like the mainstay. So that's a really good question. And I think because you don't have fleets of these vehicles out yet, we don't really know if the magnitude of the expected fuel economy will really come out in practice, or if it's primarily a projection. And I think if it's true in practice, then I think the lobby will, that'll threaten the gas model.
George Drake,
Yeah.
I've got a question about your craft.
Yeah.
Does it scare you to be writing about something that's changing so dramatically that by the time you move from manuscript to publication, you're totally outdated?
Right, and I teach 5 classes a year, right? So I can't write 20 hours a day. I should be writing 20 hours a day, right? Definitely. I mean, it scares me on the level of my kid and what he's going to do for a living and his peers. I've been studying generations for a really long time, and so it really impacts how I think about what I train my students to do. So it impacts me that way, and it totally is such a fast-moving target. That's actually why I quit writing about the drivers, because I'm like, this is going to be foolish, like at the pace at which academic publishing takes. Academic publishing, even if you're a fast writer, takes like 3 years, right? So, another book about the sociology of driverlessness, by the time it landed, you would be driving next to that car, it's just... So because I'm primarily a teacher, I can't do that kind of writing. But the other thing I would say is how much it inhabits my imagination. So if you have films that you think I should be watching, or a series, that's what I do every night now, is I watch depictions of the future and depictions of technology, because I think we need to find ways, as we've done with other stuff like the environment, to capture, think of what Al Gore did around the environment. We need ways to capture people's attention and hold their attention, because this is an easy thing to kind of look away from, but I'm pretty convinced that we need to be paying steady attention to it. So I feel like that's part of my work, is to link it to, previous revolutions, and then also this imagery to say, like, it is going to look like this, it's not going to look like this. That thing that was a fabrication, now it's reality, like that. So yeah, thanks for asking, but if you talk to my family and friends, they would be like, yeah, she's pretty obsessed right now, because it feels like one of those really fun things, like I'm well positioned as an intellectual to pursue these questions, but I'm very worried about where these questions carry us as a society.
Thank you very much, Karla.
Thank you.